I'm here to talk about my PhD research, which is in epidemic models at the University of Nottingham, with Phil O'Neill and Theo Capreas, my supervisors. So we'll start off here by looking at what an epidemic is. Here's an example here. This is the Netherlands in 2003, and this is an outbreak of bird flu. So there are about 5,500 bird farms in the Netherlands. Each dot is a farm. The red dots, so there's a cluster here and a cluster there, are farms that were infected. There's about 250 of those. The blue dots are farms that were culled preemptively, so we don't know whether they're infected or not. They were just there culled to try and stop the outbreak of the disease. So I'm interested in how can we work out how this disease is spreading. So we end up with this data here that tells us, so each farm has an ID, the location, the status, and finally the day it was culled, if it was culled. So how can we work out how it's spreading? We start off by building our model. Farms are either S for susceptible, infected, and then removed. Removed is really culled in this situation. And we think that, or we assume that once a farm is infected, it makes contact with an infected farm with a processor with rate beta. So infectious contact here, if you think about it, in people, that's you meeting someone with the flu or something like this. With bird flu, it's more like a farmer from one farm goes to another farm, or there's a delivery between farms, or maybe a wild bird flies between farms spreading the disease. So you have that Poisson process with rate beta, and then once a farm is infected, it remains so for a time period drawn from an exponential distribution, and then it's culled. But if we think about having a Poisson process with rate beta, we'd expect farms to be infected uniformly at random, but here we really don't see anything that's uniformly at random. So we need to tell the model about where the farms are located, the distances between the farms. So we do that, and instead of having that homogeneous Poisson process, we have an inhomogeneous Poisson process, where the rate between farms I and j is some function of the distance between farm I and j. And everything else is the same. So we have this inhomogeneous Poisson process now for the infection rate, and then farms are removed once they're infected for a time period drawn from an exponential distribution. But how can we specify what that function of the distance is? Well, the simplest way to do this is have a parametric model. So you think, well, the infection rate has to be positive, so it's a positive function, and also it's probably a decreasing function, so you're likely to infect your neighbours, but you're not very likely to infect farms that are on the other side of the country. So that doesn't really help us much. There are still lots of functions out there that are positive and decreasing. So two really common ones are exponential and logistic. So you say that the function of the distance is an e to the minus the distance. Why choose exponential and logistic? Really just because we're lazy. It's easy to write down logistic or exponential. We can differentiate them nicely. They're just nice mathematical functions that we can grab hold of easily. But so suppose we've chosen one, and this data set has been studied before using this method. It was studied in the Netherlands as part of the government process into this afterwards. So these authors here, they chose 4 logistic functions and the basic homogeneous one where you don't know anything about the distance. And once you've chosen this, it's really easy to fit the model. There are loads of model fitting methods out there, MLEs. You can do it in a Bayesian way if you want, doesn't really matter. And then once you've done that, you can move straight on to model assessment, and you can choose your best one. So they used AIC, you can use BIC, likelihood ratio test if you want, anything you want. So once you've chosen that function, it's really easy to do the fitting and model assessment, but there's just that flaw really at the start where you're choosing what function it is. So instead of using doing that or choosing that form, what I have been looking at is doing this non-parametrically. So you don't write down anything to do with exponential, logistic, or anything like that. You just try and learn what that function is from the data. And I've been using Gaussian processes to do that. Gaussian processes, they sound quite trendy at the moment. Lots of people are doing research into them, but really it's just the normal distribution. So if you think about the multivariate normal distribution, you have a mean vector and a covariance matrix. And this is exactly what we have here for the Gaussian process. We have a mean vector, usually 0, or you can choose whatever you like, and then some covariance matrix that tells us how different parts of the function are related to each other. So we'll do a really simple Gaussian process example here. We want to do some regression. We want to fit some kind of curve through this point, through these points here. But again, it looks a bit weird. It could be quadratic maybe. It's a bit pointy, so you could think maybe it's some weird kind of exponential thing, but let's not write anything down. Let's just try and do this non-parametrically. So we have our data, we can write down the likelihood function for that, and then we have our prior distribution. So here we've put in things like how smooth is the function? Is it continuous? Is it really wobbly, or is it quite flat? So here are 3 examples of plausible functions from the prior distribution. And then we use Bayes' theorem to combine the prior distribution with the likelihood function. And we can come up with the posterior distribution. So each grey line here is a sample from the posterior distribution. And you can come up with the mean as well. This is this black line, quantiles, anything you like really. And this is quite nice because the Gaussian process that has, you can write down the Gaussian function for that, and the likelihood as well, that's another Gaussian, so you can combine them to create a nice closed posterior distribution. Unfortunately, for the bird flu data, it's quite difficult. So we have to look at the total infectious pressure among all the farms. So this wedge here is just the minimum, so you're looking at the minimum of the removal times and the infection times. Pressures, effective individuals putting on susceptible individuals, and when they're recovering as well. So we need to look at I and R. So R here are the removal times, or the times the farms were culled. We know what those are quite well. I, however, is the infection time, so when the farms were infected with bird flu. We don't really know what that is at all. We don't observe it. We do have some data on when farmers originally contacted the government about possible infections, but that's not really that reliable. And also, we have all those farms that were culled early, that were culled without being tested, so we don't even know if they're infected or not. So the likelihood function is really difficult to compute, and also takes quite a long time to compute. So we carry on with this. We have our likelihood function there. We have we put a Gaussian process prior on the infection rate beta. We just have the log in there to ensure that the beta is positive. And then we put our exponential prior on the recovery rates, or the removal rate rather, when the farms, how long it took for the farms to be culled. And then we can use an MCMC algorithm to work out what beta is and what gamma is, the removal rate. So also, it's worth noting, we also look at the length scale of the Gaussian process. That's working out how smooth it is. But really, this is just 5 steps of the Gaussian process algorithm. We're also updating the infection time, so these are the ones we don't observe. Trying to work out when farms were infected. The bad news is this can take a very long time to run. So this can take maybe up to a week or 2 weeks, depending on how large your data set is. So for the Gaussian process, for the bird flu data, it takes about 10 days to run. So quite slow, especially compared to the parametric one, where you can fit that in, you can have it all wrapped up in a day. So there is definitely a payoff there. But let's just do a sanity check, just to make sure this Gaussian method does work. So I simulated the positions of 1,000 farms, and given those farms, I wrote down an infection rate that I knew. This is this red line here. That's the infection rate I chose. I then used that infection rate to simulate 250 outbreaks of bird flu. And for each outbreak, I then used my Gaussian process method to see if I could recover that infection rate without knowing what it was. And each grey line is one of those 250 estimates. And then the median of all 250 estimates is that black line. And we can see that we do really well. We can identify it almost exactly throughout the whole range of distances. And also estimate when the farms were infected as well. So then we can go on to our, see if we can apply it to the bird flu data set. So we have this red section here. That's the best parametric method that I could find with the dotted mean there. And our blue method, or the Gaussian process, is in here blue with the solid line. So we can see that they agree quite well after here. There is some discrepancy here, but it's mostly contained in the credible interval. And also, we can look at here, when were the farms infected? So we're estimating what day each farm was infected. And one of the key findings here is that we think there are about 30 to 40 farms that were infected before the government started, realised there was bird flu in the population and then started culling the farms. And that's my tip. If you think that there is some kind of bird flu epidemic, you need to start culling as soon as possible. You may not ever face this problem, but that's my tip to you. Because if you don't start culling straight away, then you're just playing catch up the whole time. So this method can work. We recover quite similar methods, but also we get that key information about when farms are infected. So yeah, that's what I've shown. We can do this non-parametrically. We don't need to write down any form, exponential, logistic, anything like that. You do know a lot less about the function, because if you write down exponential function or parametric form, you can find out the differentiate it, find out lots of information about this function. I can't really tell you that. I can tell you some numerical things, but that's about it. But crucially, it's a lot more flexible because I haven't written down that parametric form. One of the big downsides to the Gaussian process method is that you have that covariance matrix. So for the bird flu data, there's 5,500 farms. If you look at the pairwise distances, compute the distance between every pair of farms, you end up with about 14 million. So your covariance matrix is something like 14 million by 14 million. That's huge. You can't really do that normally and work with it all the time. So I've come up with a method to approximate based on a smaller covariance matrix. And now I'm looking at including more information, so about whether the farms were turkey farms or chicken farms, and how many animals were on each farm.
So my name is Laura, and I'm a statistician and NIHR doctoral fellow at the University of Sheffield. And today I'm going to talk about using health economics in the design, monitoring and analysis of adaptive clinical trials. So just a few acknowledgements to begin with. I am funded by the NIHR, so I'll views on my own in this presentation. And also just a thanks to my supervisors for their help and sort of contribution to the work that I'm presenting today. To start off with, I'm going to give a bit of background about health economics and adaptive designs, because I'm aware that some people might not be too familiar with those topics. And then I'm going to outline my research aims for the fellowship, and then talk specifically about one aspect, which is thinking about the health economic analysis that follows a group sequential design. So in the UK and around the world, we have limited resources for funding healthcare interventions, so new drugs or new surgical procedures, and we also have limited budgets for funding health research. So we really only want to be funding those treatments that pay for the biggest improvements in health for the money that we're spending, but also for that research that only really accurately informs the decisions about which treatments we should be paying for. So the methods of health economics are really important here because they help us to try and maximise those health gains, so things like quality of life, for the amount of money that we're spending. So I'm interested in two aspects of health economics. The first is economic evaluation. So this is trying to work out whether our new drug, our new intervention is cost effective. So is it worthwhile paying for a new drug that reduces blood pressure? And then I'm also interested in the methods of value of information analysis. So this is trying to work out, is it cost effective to do a piece of research? So is it a cost effective way to spend our limited budget funding another trial that looks at different treatments for blood pressure, given what we know already, how uncertain we are about the decision about which treatment should be funded, and how much we're likely to learn from a trial and how much that's going to cost us. So I'm not going to talk too much about the value of information aspect of the project today, but if anyone is interested in how we can use that in adaptive trials, then please do come and speak to me. But you can see how important it is in sort of the decision-making process as a whole, trying to help us work out what we should be funding to try and help us make those decisions about which treatments should be funded. So decision makers, such as the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, have this really difficult decision about what should be funded and made available to patients on the NHS. We've got loads of treatments and loads of different illnesses and diseases, and we need to choose which ones are given the limited budget. And there are always going to be winners and losers in these situations, so we need to try and do this in a way that's as fair and transparent as possible. And so we need to weigh up how well a treatment works, is it clinically effective, and how cost effective it is it value for money to fund that particular treatment over something else. And quite often, evidence to try and inform these types of decisions comes from clinical trials. So typically, a clinical trial can be quite big, it can take a long time, and it can typically need quite a lot of resources, and so that's not really ideal when we've got a very limited budget for funding our clinical trials. And so researchers have tried to come up with an alternative that tries to do things a bit more efficiently. And so an adaptive design is one way that they've tried to do this. So traditionally, we run fixed sample size design trials. So we design our study, we conduct the trial, so we collect all of our data, and then once all the data is collected, we will then think about the analysis. But an adaptive design is slightly different, and it sort of says that why not make use of that data as it's being collected to inform changes and modifications to the trial. So we've got this sort of feedback loop. This feedback loop that sort of says, we design a study, we start off collecting data from participants, and then we review it, and we use this to inform a change or modification to the study. So this has a number of advantages over the fixed design trial. It can save us time and it can save us resources, but it also has this important ethical angle as well that sort of prevents patients from being needlessly randomised to interventions as soon as we know which one is better and which one is not. So there's a whole host of different types of adaptive designs that exist, and they range from sort of quite complex multi-arm, multi-stage trials that can run for long periods of time, or more simple types of adaptive designs. And I'm going to focus on the group sequential design, which sort of falls into this more simpler kind of adaptive trial, but it's also one of the most common types of adaptive trials that's actually used in practice. It seems like a sensible place to start. So in a group sequential design, we examine the data after groups of patients have reached our outcome of interest. And quite often, that outcome of interest is our clinical primary outcome. So we use this information at our pre-planned interim analysis to try and evaluate whether at that point we've got enough information to stop the trial early. So you might want to stop because our new treatment's working really well, or we might want to stop because actually it's not working as well as we expected and we should sort of cut our losses at that point. So to try and work out what is sufficient information to stop, stopping rules have been developed that kind of predefine hurdles that we need to reach if we're going to be able to stop the trial at that point. And there's lots of different types of stopping rule that exist, and your choice will sort of depend on the type of trial that you're running and maybe your risk aversion. So some rules allow you to stop very early on in the study, but that might not suit you and the particular trial that you're running. So you might go for something that's maybe quite hard to stop at the beginning of the study, but is a bit easier to stop later on once you've got more information. But one thing that they all have in common is that they are generally focused on trying to demonstrate that we've got enough information about the clinical effectiveness. So just as a really simple example of a group sequential design, here we've got a trial that has 3 interim analyses and a final analysis. And we've got a stopping boundary, here this is the Pocock stopping rule. We've got an upper boundary, so if we cross this upper boundary at any point, we've got sufficient evidence to stop the trial and declare our new intervention superior to the control. And likewise, if we stop down here, because we cross this lower boundary, we've got enough information now to declare the control treatment superior to the intervention. So what we do, we start our trial as we would as if it was a fixed design. We start randomising patients and collecting information about their primary outcome. And we calculate the difference in means in this case, which is the y-axis here. So this could be, say, we're comparing 2 drugs for blood pressure. This could be the difference in blood pressure between the intervention arm and the control arm. So you can see from our first 38 participants here, we calculate the difference in means and it's really close to 0. We're well within that boundary, so at the moment we've not got enough information to stop the trial. And so we carry on collecting information from the next 38 participants. We recalculate the difference in means here, and this is based on everyone that's been randomised and reached that primary outcome in the trial so far. So here it's 76 participants. And again, within the boundary, so we carry on to the 3rd interim analysis. So we notice now that we crossed this upper stopping boundary. So we've got, I think it's about 114 participants in the study at this point. We've calculated the difference in means, and we've now crossed the upper boundary. So at this point, we now have enough information to stop the trial early and declare that the new intervention is superior to the control. And so this has 2 obvious advantages. We can stop recruiting participants at this point, so we don't need to now needlessly randomise any more participants because we've got our answer. But we also save the time and resources that we would have spent had we carried on to the 152 participants. So we can move on to the next stage of the sort of drug development process and get things through that process much quicker. So as I mentioned, decision makers need to make a decision about which treatment should be funded and made available to patients. And to do this, they need to weigh up and balance how well the treatment works. So is our drug that's supposed to lower blood pressure lowering people's blood pressure? And also, is it value for money? So is the benefit that people get from taking that drug worth the amount it costs to fund and give to people on the NHS? And so at the moment, despite its importance to decision makers, cost effectiveness is a secondary outcome in the design of all trials, but especially in adaptive designs, where we're really designing the study and monitoring it based on the clinical outcome. And so I'm concerned that if we're carrying out a group sequential design and we're really only thinking about the clinical effectiveness, we might be firstly missing an opportunity to be thinking about cost effectiveness at an interim analysis. Could we be making decisions to stop or modify the trial on cost effectiveness grounds that we're just not really doing at the moment? But also importantly, if we're using a group sequential design to collect information about health economic outcomes, are there certain things that we need to be doing to allow for the fact that the trial was an adaptive design that maybe we're not doing at the moment, that could be sort of making us make maybe not the best possible decision about which treatment should be funded on the NHS? So the overall research aim of my fellowship is to answer the question, can adaptive designs and health economics be used together to increase the efficiency of our health technology assessments, but doing this without compromising the accuracy of the analyses that we do? It's obviously quite a broad question, so I've broken it down into 5 smaller questions, and I'm going to just focus on one of those today. And so that's thinking about what adjustment should we undertake for the health economic analysis that follows an adaptive design. And so the reason I've chosen this question is because when we run clinical trials in general, we quite often piggyback the health economic analysis onto the end of the study. So while we might have some health economic outcomes collected as part of the trial, the main focus is on the clinical effectiveness. And this means that when it comes to the health economic analysis at the end of the trial, there might be certain things that we need to do to allow for the fact that we've used an adaptive design. So we know from the literature on group sequential trials that when we do this type of trial, we need to think really carefully about the analysis at the end of the study. It's not appropriate to just use the same methods we would have used had it been a fixed design study. We know that the treatment effect will be biased when we've used a group sequential design. So if we stop the trial early because we crossed that upper boundary, the point estimate of our treatment effect is actually going to be biased upwards. And if we've stopped and crossed that lower boundary, it's going to be biased downwards. There's also implications for the confidence interval as well. It might not have those desirable properties that we look for, such as containing the maximum likelihood estimate and having the right sort of coverage that we want from a confidence interval. There are also issues for any secondary outcomes that we collect during the group sequential design that are correlated with the primary outcome. And they can also be vulnerable to this same sort of bias. And quite often we will collect information during the study about health economic outcomes such as quality of life and costs. And it's quite reasonable to assume that there might be correlation between our health economic outcomes and the clinical primary outcome. So if we've got a new drug that lowers someone's blood pressure, this might mean that they're able to do certain tasks that they weren't able to do before, which improves their quality of life. And they may not need to go to as many hospital appointments or visit the GP as often, which might reduce the amount of cost that they incur during the trial. And so there's correlation between our primary outcome and our health economic secondary outcomes. And so if we're using these outcomes in our health economic analysis, are we introducing bias into that analysis and therefore potentially making the wrong types of decisions around which treatment should be funded on the NHS? So luckily there are some adjustments that we can make to the point estimate and the confidence interval that follow a group sequential design. So I'm not going to talk too much about these today, but you can essentially take your maximum likelihood estimate of your primary outcome and subtract some estimate of the bias. And this gives you the bias adjusted maximum likelihood estimate. And you can do a similar sort of thing for your secondary outcomes. So again, you take the maximum likelihood estimate and subtract some estimate of the bias. And we can see here that this depends on the correlation between the primary and secondary outcome and an estimate of the bias of the primary outcome as well. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is I'm running a simulation study that looks at simulating lots of group sequential designs like the one I showed that have a maximum of 4 analyses. And what we're trying to do is say, if we've got a group sequential design and we do a within-trial health economic analysis and a model-based analysis, what happens when we don't adjust at all for the fact that it's a group sequential design? Do we get bias in the health economics? And if we do adjust, does this help reduce any potential bias that we get in the health economic analysis that follows? And we know from the literature that if we vary different characteristics in the sort of group sequential design, such as the stopping rule that we use and the correlation between the endpoints, this has an impact on the level of bias that you get. And so what I'd like to try and do is say, if you've not got much correlation between your primary and health economic outcomes, then you don't need to worry, you don't need to adjust. But there might be certain cases where this sort of switches and you actually really do need to think about adjustments for your health economic analysis. So just to conclude, adaptive designs are becoming an increasingly popular way to run clinical trials because they have a lot of advantages over the fixed sample size design trials. They can save us time and resources and can help us be a bit more efficient with our limited research budget. But at the moment, it seems that despite its importance to decision makers, cost effectiveness is often not really thought about in the design, monitoring or analysis of these types of trials. And this has the potential to waste resources, and maybe we could be making the wrong decisions because we've got inaccurate health economic analyses. So we want to make sure that the NHS and patients can continue to benefit from all those advantages of adaptive design, but we want to make sure that we're doing this using the appropriate methods with appropriate adjustments so that we're not compromising the accuracy of health economic analyses and decision making.
So this work is in partnership with BT, and their interest in this work is really to do with streaming data. And I'll be getting into sort of a little bit as to why later on. But I thought I'd unpick the word changepoint in this title a bit first. So what do I mean by a changepoint? Well, basically it's just where something changes, a point in time where something changes. So we could have a change in mean, a change in variance, a change in mean and variance if we want to get very exciting, or just a change in some other parameter here. For this talk we're just going to be really boring and focus on change in mean. Change in mean only under some constant, and we'll take it as known variance. So here's the problem. So we have some signal with, again, the variance known. We're going to take our signal as being Gaussian, just because it makes the maths a bit easier. And we're just going to have some changes in mean happening at some unknown number of times. But it's fixed, and it's n. Now, in terms of univariate change point detection, the sort of best method out there is PELT. Now, of course, I'm slightly biased because PELT is a Lancaster method, and this, of course, is written by people from Lancaster. But it's a nice linear method. It's exact, and I'll go through exactly what I mean by exact shortly. And it sort of achieves this, typical computational speed of order n. Incidentally, PELT is the sort of first warning in this talk as to why you should always check your method on Urban Dictionary before naming it. That's not an invitation to go on Urban Dictionary. So the exact part of the name from PELT comes from the fact that it exactly solves this equation here. So this equation here has some segmented cost function, whereby if we take our estimated change points and our estimated change number, within this segment we have some cost, which could be sort of residual sum of squares, it could be negative log likelihood, something like that. We have some penalty to avoid overfitting, because otherwise we just have to change at every single point in time. And sort of reasonable questions that might arise from this include a sensible choice of beta, a sensible choice of the cost, and so on. But first of all, we'll just go through exactly why PELT is able to achieve this nice order n time. Because obviously if we just take this and then we just apply some kind of dynamic programming horribleness here, we typically get sort of this order n squared type complexity. And indeed, you do need a kind of a nice little observation on this to sort of get things down to order n in the usual case. And it just basically boils down to the fact that if you observe something that looks very like a change in the recent past, you can prune out most things that you've seen in the past as other candidates for the most recent change point. So that's all PELT does as a kind of extension to the kind of dynamic programming setup, is it really speeds up this mechanism. So while it is often fast, this PELT method, it can have these computation times of order n squared. And obviously in this sort of streaming data setup that I'm talking about with BT, where we have typically lots of dimensions as well as lots of points in time, order n squared is not really something we want to be taking forward. But we can use parallelization. It's the sort of final word from the title. So here are just some applications I've sort of pulled from the literature, a very cursory glance at the literature over the last 20 years. And these are incidentally some pictures that I took. So this is a picture of Lancaster, a typical day's weather in Lancaster before I left. This incidentally is not a picture of Lancaster that I've taken recently because there's trains in a station in the north. But yeah, so the point is parallelization is a very popular means of speeding up methods like this. So we have two proposed means of speeding up PELT based on parallelization, specifically on split and merge. So these are the kind of base pictures for what we're doing. This on the left is called chunk, this on the left is called deal. Now these pictures, I never find these particularly helpful. I think it's more helpful to think about these pictures. So we have here a chocolate bar and just a nice typical game of poker, so typical Friday night at my house basically. So we'll go through chunk first. So imagine we have the data as a bar of chocolate, and we're just giving the blocks of chocolate to the different cores. The cores then process the blocks of chocolate, and they say, okay, there's a change at this point in the block, and give this back to the parent core, and the parent core then analyzes the entire data set, but only then can fit change points at points that have been flagged as changes by the child cores. The only other thing about a chocolate bar that's of note, I guess, is that obviously it's not just composed of the blocks, there's an overlap in the middle. So there's an overlap between two blocks, which is processed by the cores either side of it. The point of that is, if you think back to the picture on the previous slide, where we had the big jump that was sort of right in the middle between two cores, that's unlikely to be seen by either core. So there needs to be a little bit of sort of leeway in between. Deal works very similarly. The merge phase is identical, except that the way in which we split the data set up to begin with is a little bit different. So instead of just breaking it into contiguous blocks, PELT deals the points as if it was, if it was a card dealer to the different cores. And then again, each core is only allowed to fit a change point model with the points that it's being given as possible changes. So the point is, as it's searching through doing this dynamic programming thing, it's got far fewer candidates that could be changes in the past. So each core is massively sped up, and hopefully there's still going to be some accuracy. But now that we've defined these two parallelization methods, we do have two major questions that arise. The first one, of course, and probably the most important, is do these methods still detect changes reasonably accurately? So PELT's great because it sort of exactly solves this minimization cost function, but does a similar result hold for chunk and deal? And if it is accurate, then do these parallelization techniques represent a speed up relative to PELT, which is significant? So let's define what we mean by sort of good or statistically good in this setting. So we'll look at asymptotic consistency, and we'll say that we have these change points tau, and they correspond to some change proportion theta. So if we have the change point tau I, then this corresponds to some change proportion theta I. Then we say that a method is asymptotically consistent if we find these change proportions in probability as our length of the data set n becomes very large. So here's an asymptotic consistency result to what I made earlier. So the consistency of PELT, if we let alpha be greater than 0, and we apply the PELT procedure with some number of changes at unknown points, minimizing squared error loss, and we take beta, our penalty, to be 2 times log n, with some epsilon factor in here that's necessary for the convergence to hold. Then we take our estimated change points that we get from running PELT. Then it turns out the probability of this event, which is down here, tends to 1 as n tends to infinity. And this event is just basically saying that we don't miss the true points by too much with the estimated points. By too much, I mean sort of within order log n, which is why we have this kind of alpha greater than 0 factor up here. It's missing by at most log n to the 1 plus alpha. We do get, incidentally, a sort of finite sample result as well, but I thought I wouldn't frazzle the slides too much with maths, and B, frazzle my brain too much as I was writing the maths on the slides. We can also get an equivalent result for the multivariate setting, which I guess BT is more interested in, but we do need to change the penalty slightly from 2 log n to sort of something on the order of d log n. just as a quick aside. Okay, so based on that consistency result that we get for pelt, we can get equivalent consistency results for chunk and deal. So it turns out they're both consistent as well with sort of these same E events, provided that we also have some constraints on the number of cores that we use. So for chunk, we do need that the number of cores is sort of relatively small compared to n, but is still growing as n grows. For deal, we also need that there's this additional annoying constraint, which is an artifact of the proof technique. And we sort of do see that this is kind of important because we have a small n case later where sort of deal performs slightly less well than chunk. But we do need this additional constraint on deal in order for consistency to hold. Okay, so that's all very well for consistency. What about the speed? So the speed is kind of why we're here. So it turns out that the speed relative to pelt, which is kind of order n squared in the worst case, is sort of sped up by a factor of ln squared. So, well, ln is the number of cores that we're using. So this isn't too bad, because if we sort of set ln to be root n, then we get this kind of fabled order n complexity that we've been searching for so long in the worst case. So this is rather good. Obviously, it does rely on us having a sort of root n number of cores, but I'll sort of let BT take care of that. So let's focus on sort of a quick simulation study just as a kind of sanity check. So we have 5 scenarios here with 2, 3, 6, 9, and 14 changes. Incidentally, this one here has a very, very small kind of anomalous segment in here, hence the reason why you might not be able to see 3 changes, but that's just to sort of really test the methods and to check that they're detecting them. So we're allowing ln to be 4 here, in all cases. Note that this is sort of less than log n to the 1 plus alpha, because here we've got n's 1 times 10 to the 5. So, thank you. So this note about deal requiring, for deal's consistency, needing ln to be a certain size needs to be borne in mind somewhat. 200 repetitions, and we got the following. So the relative computational gain compared to pelt, hope I can convince you there that it's sort of roughly on the order of about 16, sort of n squared. So it's representing sort of a significant speed up compared to pelt, certainly. And just to sort of show off the kind of similar statistical properties to pelt, so chunk is sort of very nicely mirroring the number of false alarms that we get from pelt across all these repetitions. Deal is sort of performing on the same lines, not quite as well because of this additional constraint that deal requires. And if we sort of compare this to kind of another leading method, wild binary segmentation, we kind of see that certainly chunk is doing very well by comparison and deal's not doing too badly at all. Now, of course, sort of final issue is pelt exactly minimizes this cost function, and that's kind of why it's one reason why it's a majorly used method. How well did chunk and deal do in comparison? Just a quick sanity check. So in terms of this cost function, chunk gets extremely close to minimizing it. Deal isn't too far off. This 2, incidentally, is compared to a sort of typical cost on the order of 100,000 in the sort of cases that we were looking at. So 2 here is sort of quite insignificant. So all in all, these methods seem to be performing well. So some other stuff that we've been looking at more recently. Sort of this was stuff that I was using to keep myself out of trouble during this kind of first year of the PhD. With sort of more complex models, so penalty setting under heavier tails, sort of anomaly-rich data. Obviously, we're just kind of constricting ourselves to the Gaussian case here. We're looking at a multivariate extension to this. So there's this method called ASMOP, which is kind of another almost exact method in the multivariate setting. And SMOP, incidentally, is the second warning in this talk as to why you should always check Urban Dictionary before naming your methods. And then finally, the kind of holy grail of our PhD would really be to come up with some kind of online change detection method for the multivariate setting.